Good evening. So I knew at the beginning of this week, because I've been trying to be better at my calendar, that tonight was going to be trunk or treat. So with the lesson this evening, I had two goals in mind. One of them was for it to be slightly shorter, and that's for a couple of reasons. One is because we don't yet have a lot of light in our parking lot, and the little bit we have is very precious. One of the reasons was because I assumed there were going to be a little bit more children here tonight, and I don't know about everyone's child, but I know about me as a child, and I know about my child that it's hard to sit still for long periods of time when it's already getting late, and you know that there's going to be something really fun really, really soon. And then the third reason I wanted to keep it shorter is a selfish one. It was because I knew that I would be standing up here looking out at my car, knowing that my greatest temptation, the Reese's peanut butter cup, was just sitting there waiting for me. That was the first thing I tried to remember. The second thing I was trying to remember when constructing this lesson was that I wanted it to be somewhere along the lines of having a theme that revolved around the idea of wearing costumes. And I will admit right here and right now that I'm not confident that I remembered both of those things while writing it, and I'm not confident which one, if either, that I did. But tonight we're going to be starting in Matthew chapter 23. We're going to look at the first 7 verses of that chapter. But before that, I do have a story that relates to that theme, and I'll preface it like I usually do with this. This is obviously a preacher story. It's obviously one of those things where it's a cute story, it's a little funny of a story, it has a good message, but I'm 99% sure this never happened. Maybe a little more. Anyway, here it is. Imagine a well-built young man. He was eager to earn some money, and he saw an advertisement for a job at the zoo. So he goes in and he sits down for this interview, and they pull out a gorilla suit. And he looks confused, and he goes, I thought I was going to be working with the gorillas. I didn't think I was going to be the gorillas. And they explained to him, no, we have a lot of children coming in from the schools this time of year, and we don't have a gorilla, and they want to see a gorilla. So we need you to be the gorilla. And the young man sat and thought about it for a minute. He goes, okay, fine, I'll be the gorilla. I need money, and there are worse ways to spend your days than eating bananas and peanuts and sitting in a tree. So he starts that job. And day in and day out, that's what he does. The kids throw peanuts at him. He eats bananas from his little bucket. He sits and swings from the trees. But eventually, being a gorilla is actually kind of tiring work. So he gets tired, and eventually he loses his grip while swinging from tree to tree, and he falls into the lion's den next to him. And at that point, he no longer cared about the job. He cared about his life. So he started screaming, help me, help me, help me, help me, help me. And right as he was about to try to crawl over the fence, the lion leans over and whispers to him, if you don't keep your mouth shut, we're both going to lose our jobs. It's a cute story. It's a funny story. I enjoyed it a lot. And there's a moral to it, right? Just because something looks like a gorilla doesn't mean it is a gorilla. Just because something looks like a lion doesn't mean it is a lion. Just because something looks like the church doesn't mean it is the church. And just because someone looks like a Christian, it doesn't always mean that they live like one. And in Matthew 23, we're going to see Jesus talking about the scribes and the Pharisees. And I think that's exactly what he's talking about, is somebody who is looking the part to a T. But they're not necessarily what they claim to be. So let's go ahead and begin in Matthew 23, starting in verse 1. Then Jesus said to the crowds and his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, so do and observe what they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach, but they do not practice. And I'm going to go through this passage, and I'm going to point out 5 masks that I think the Pharisees were wearing. And these are 5 masks that I think sometimes we slip on ourselves. And the first one here, I think, is obvious. It's hypocrisy. Jesus is criticizing the Pharisees for their hypocrisy. They sit in Moses' seat, they teach God's laws, but their actions do not align with what they are telling the other people to do. The Greek word here that we translate The Greek word that we translate hypocrisy typically actually is someone who performs a role. It's a word that they would use to describe an actor. And that's what hypocrisy is. It's playing a role, being someone you're not, pretending to be something that you are not at all. And I think that's something that's easy to do. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 16, Paul tells Timothy, keep a close watch on yourself and on the teaching. Persist in this, for by doing so, you'll save both yourself and your hearers. I think it's interesting that Paul here, when instructing Timothy, a young preacher, somebody who was mentoring, he wanted to emphasize these two things in one sense. Pay attention to what you do and pay attention to what you're teaching, right? Because those are connected. If you're doing one and not the other, if you're teaching one thing and doing something else, you're a hypocrite. And he points out here that if you're not a hypocrite, you'll save both yourself and your hearers. And we can infer the inverse of this, that if you are a hypocrite, you're going to hurt yourself and your hearers. In James chapter 1, verse 22, he echoes this idea, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourself. And it's easy to be a hypocrite. It's an easy mask to slip on because it's easy to say what you're supposed to do, right? It's easy to tell somebody else, this is what you ought to be doing according to God's word. This is what you are supposed to do. But then when you look in the mirror or somebody says it to you, it's a lot harder to hear. It's a lot harder to practice because that usually means you have to admit that you're in the wrong. And we don't like doing that. And the Pharisees didn't like doing that. In fact, they thought that they were above that. And that brings us to verse 4 with my second mask that I think they put on, which I'll tell you now, I think they're elitist. In verse 4, Jesus says, they tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. The Pharisees here are imposing heavy burdens on others, unnecessary rules, unnecessary standards, things that they are calling religious law that aren't religious law, and they are placing all of this on the back of the people, and then they don't care to do a single one of those. The extra sacrifices and the extra prayers and all of these extra things that they tacked on, that's for thee, but not for me. In Romans chapter 14, verse 13, it says, therefore, let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or a hindrance in the way of a brother. And I think that's the goal. But sometimes we think, and I say we, and as usual, I say we with a little bit of admittance. Sometimes I think that we are better than the other people, whether that's people who aren't in the church, whether that's people who are new to the faith, maybe people who have been in the faith longer than we have. But we sometimes look at ourselves and say, I'm doing a better job. I'm above them. I'm above that. Whatever their struggles are, that's a them problem because I don't struggle with that and I am better. And therefore, yeah, they're going to have to deal with a lot of extra things that I don't have to do. And we embrace this attitude. We combine these masks of hypocrisy and elitism, and we start thinking that we don't need to care about other people. And that hurts us, right? That hurts our relationship with God and ourselves, and it hurts our relationship with the other people, but it also hurts them. It hurts their relationship with themselves, their relationship with us, the church, their relationship with God, all because we've decided to put on these masks of hypocrisy and elitism, thinking we're better, thinking we're above, thinking we don't need to practice what we preach, all because we're scared to look in the mirror. And looking in the mirror, let's continue. Verses 5, 6, and 7. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the places of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplace and being called rabbi by the others. The third mask, the third fault, and you'll see this is where I think the theme started to slip away from me, but I think this point that Jesus is making is just as important as the others. The Pharisees were judging other people by external measures, and they were judging themselves by external measures. It was all about who looked the part, It didn't matter how your soul was, how your heart was, what your mind was thinking. It was all, do you look pious enough? They did all of their deeds to be seen by others. They made their phylacteries broad. They made their fringes long. They loved to sit in places of honor at feasts where people could look at them. They wanted the best seats in the synagogue so people could see them, not because they cared, but because they wanted to be seen in those best seats, because being a front row person made them look religious. And they loved the titles and the greetings in the marketplace, being called rabbi, being looked at as better than all the others. And as Christians, I think sometimes we do both sides of this, right? We put on our quote unquote, and I say this not in the positive way we typically say it, but we put on our quote unquote Sunday best because we want to look the best. We post on Facebook and on Instagram and on social media the things that we want the world to know about our lives. Not exactly all of it. And then we look at other people. And when we see the reality of life, the messiness of life, the struggles that we as humans go through, and we see that honesty, instead of commending honesty and transparency, something that is so difficult to do, we see it and we judge others by it. In Matthew 23, verse 27, later on in this passage, Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and uncleanliness." And then in 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, Samuel is trying to find a king for Israel. And God says to him, "Do not look on his appearance, or on his height, or on his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." And that's what we do. We look on the outward, and I don't say that only in the negative way. We don't have the divine ability to know the heart of everybody we meet. But with a little bit of effort, a little bit of caring, a little bit of love and compassion, it's not that difficult to see the heart of other people, to see what they care about, what they believe in, to see through the facade that we always have to put on, and to know who they are. But that's difficult. Like I said, that requires us to be caring and compassionate and loving. That requires us to get to know somebody. That's work. What isn't work is judging somebody by what you can see, by looking at the messiness of their life, because life is messy for all of us. Just some of us are better at hiding it, putting on those masks than others, looking at that messiness and judging them. And I think tonight, what I'm trying to say is, I know that I put on masks, right? I know that I put on a facade at times. I know that I want to look the part. And I know that when I do it, it is wrong. I know that when I do it, it is deceptive, it is lying, it is a mask. It's not who I am. It's hypocrisy. We talked about the Greek word that we often translate as hypocrisy. It means playing a part, playing a role. And that's often what I'm afraid that we as Christians do. Because it's easier to play a role than to be a new creation. It's easier to look like one than it is to be actually transformed. So tonight I ask that you look in the mirror, that when you sit down at the edge of your bed, when you pray at night, when you think about your day, you ask yourself, did I put on a mask? Did I judge others? Did I practice in what we call elitism or hypocrisy? Did I judge people by their externals? Did I do anything that wasn't honest to who I truly am? And if the answer is yes, and if you're anything like me and you look hard enough, you're always going to find somewhere in your day to say yes to. I ask that you pray on it, that you study on it, that you try to find the ways to change it, so that when the sun rises again tomorrow, the next day, you don't do that again. Queen Mary was once the largest and most majestic ship to cross the oceans when it launched. It was 1936. For over 4 decades, it sailed proudly, it served in World War II, and then eventually was retired as a floating hotel and a museum in Long Beach, California. The problem was that this was a ship that worked. This was a ship that did a lot of heavy lifting in its heyday. So when it came time for the conversion process, for turning it into a hotel and a museum on the beach of Long Beach, they had a lot of what I call landlord specials to do. If you're not familiar with the term landlord specials, it's when you see rust and rot and holes in the wall and you go, I know how to fix that. And you fix that by pulling out a paintbrush and a bucket of white paint and painting over it, because if you can't see the rust and you can't see the hole, you can't see the destruction, it's not there. So that's what they did. They painted over all of this rusted, thick pieces of steel. Problem was, when it eventually opened and people started to walk on it, paint crumbles under the weight of a human being. And so people started to fall through. They would stomp on their feet and they would kick their foot through the floors of this ship. And although when it opened, the ship looked beautiful and perfect, like it was the first day it had ever sailed, underneath the paint, underneath the mask, it was rotted and broken and falling apart. So I think the challenge for us tonight is to find ways to take that mask off, to be honest, to be brutally honest with ourselves and with others, that we are broken people, that our lives are messy, that we have struggles and we have temptations and we have points where we fall short and we fail and we mess up and we make mistakes. Because by putting on masks and pretending that we are better than the world, that we are above humanity and the messiness that it is, we lie to ourselves, we hurt our relationship with ourselves, we hurt our relationship with God, and we hurt our relationship with our brothers and sisters and the people who have not yet come to know God. So again, I remind you, if there's any way you can make that change, to unmask yourself, and if there's any way that the church here can help you, then after the invitation, I ask that you come forward. But if you've not yet put on Christ through baptism, if you've not yet been truly transformed into a new creation, if you have not yet been added to God's family, adopted into an inheritance which we can't deserve, and there's any way that we can help you on that journey, whether that be studying, whether that to be baptized, whether that be prayers, whatever your needs are, if the body here at Stewart can help you in any way, I ask that you come forward as we stand and sing.